Anyways, yeah, I'll try and keep this fairly brief. I'm just kind of representative of the evil regulator side of this issue. I agree with almost everything Dr. Bain just said around the ecological impacts and what we should or should not care about, but I guess part of my job here is to articulate to the best I can kind of the regulatory problem, the regulatory conundrum that we encounter as regulators on this particular file. And so I'm going to speak to that to a certain extent. And I have not included, I myself am a bit of an ecocrat now, for sure. I don't get to do actual biology much anymore, but I don't get to do a lot of public speaking either, actually, so I apologize in advance for being stilted. However, I do have a fair amount of experience in this file, and not everything is represented in what I have, this semi-canned presentation that I'm giving here, so I'm happy to, despite the fact that this thing is on, talk about other experiences around being on the kind of pointy end of the stick with respect to interactions with enforcement, on specific complaints around incidental take, and I'm also willing to talk to solutions that right now are not on the table federally, including some sort of a regulatory framework approach. Those aren't in my talk, but happy to talk about them. So let me see if I don't. Do we have to do something to get, oh, there it goes. All right, so yeah, this is basically what I'm trying to do. The basic outline, I'll give a little bit of the legislative context for incidental take and the current challenges in addressing it. A little bit about the description of the ECCC developed tools and key policy positions that I think might be most relevant to this group. It's mostly the content of the website that I'm guessing a bunch of you have already looked at. And a little bit on the tally work that Dr. Bain also referred to there, just at the end, just kind of a broad sweep, the magnitude of different types of incidental take or other kinds of avian mortality. Some of these are gray areas, by the way. Like cats is not necessarily a form of incidental take in some sense, in a regulatory sense, or that's the current thinking on that one. So again, the legislative context comes from the Migratory Birds Convention Act 1994. Killing, harming of birds and destruction, disturbance of nests are both prohibited via the MBCA. But also in the context, the MBCA itself doesn't really have too much in the way of active prohibitions. They're found in the MBR, the Migratory Birds Regs, but the purpose of the act, of the MBCA, the purpose statement is important. This act is to implement the Convention protecting and conserving migratory birds as both populations and individuals and their nests. So here are some of the active prohibitions to consider with respect to this particular regulatory problem. First, MBCA 5.1, no person or vessel shall deposit a substance that is harmful to migratory birds. And that's not one that you probably deal with particularly too much here. Tailings ponds is one where you can think about that. Obviously, chronic oil spill is one that we engage in a fair amount in the marine environment. Secondly, the MBR general prohibition, no person shall hunt a migratory bird except under authority of a permit therefor. But so this is a fairly problematic prohibition, the way it's currently worded. But the hunt definition is very broad. I still think personally somewhat problematic. But this is the prohibition that is thought to kind of deal with issues around or deal with issues around the incidental take of individual birds. But so you can see the wording there in the hunt definition. You really have to go to the interpretation section of the regs to kind of cash this out. Chase, pursue, worry, follow after, or on the trail of, lie in wait for, or attempt in any manner to capture, kill, injure, harass a migratory bird, whether or not the migratory bird is captured, killed, or injured. I think there's still a problem with the intentionality of that second clause for us, but that's still meant to broadly cover the idea that even if you're that killing individual birds as opposed to their nests is also a form of incidental take. It's interesting to compare that prohibition language to the one in the SARA. And I will say that which is a very direct prohibition against kill, harm, harass. So, and I will say that internally there's certainly a move afoot to return the MBR general prohibition there to its original wording, which was more like the SARA. The MBR general prohibition around nest destruction is a little bit more straightforward for us. No person shall disturb, destroy, or take a nest shelter, either duck shelter, etc., or have in possession a live migratory bird. And other sections and acts, regulations apply. Certainly the provincial wildlife acts have similar legislation that behaves in similar ways. The Species at Risk Act interacts in ways with the Migratory Birds Convention Act that some people may be familiar with. So essentially the residence component of the prohibitions in the Species at Risk Act relate to the MBCA. In that the part of the MBCA nest prohibition that is protected under the MBCA forms the minimum part of residence description under the SARA. That's one example. It's interesting that the SARA allows for incidental effects permits to be authorized as long as it meets certain preconditions under that act. But because of the existence of the MBCA, this cannot be done for migratory birds, because you would have a conflict in the two. There's essentially a conflict in the two pieces of legislation there. So the department has legal mechanisms in place to manage the intentional or direct take of birds and their eggs and nests, and so these are ways in which we can, under the MBR, authorize certain types of take. And so these are ones you'd probably be familiar with: permits for specific activities, scientific activities, avicultural permits, damage or danger permits, for instance, crop predation, airport permits, taxidermy, eider down, all those kinds of things. But outside of these permit authorizations, really, we don't have a legal mechanisms to authorize any other form of take, whether intentional or not. It's a strict liability offense in those situations. And that's really the crux of the problem. There's no legal mechanism for us to do that currently. So obviously in some circumstances, the killing or harming of birds or destruction or disturbance of nests is the result of human activities that aren't directed at the birds, nests, or eggs, and this is incidental take. This is the definition. So this slide is just to kind of indicate which forms of incidental take that the department are interested in. Clearly on the left, these are directed take activities, hunting, collecting eggs. That's not incidental take. On the far right, there are kind of accidental things that are regarded as somehow accidental, like collisions with my killing the Gillibrie's warbler, for instance, would be considered some form of accidental take. And then the ones in the middle are the ones that we all have to deal with, probably, and you guys have to deal with in this room. And these are the ones that the department is interested in dealing with. Of course, we have a challenge here. There is the conservation aspect to this bird. Many birds' eggs, nests are destroyed each year during routine industrial and other activities. I think Dr. Bain made lots of great points about the sense in which we should be wanting to unpack that and nuance that, but there is a conservation issue at heart with respect to this. But there's this legal uncertainty. There's no authorization mechanism for stakeholders. So occurrences of incidental take of migratory birds, nests, or eggs do have the potential to result in investigation and potentially prosecution under the Act. So incidental take is always a contravention of the MBCA. There is no legal mechanism to exempt individuals, actors, from these prohibitions for the kinds of reasons that we're talking about today. So this is a little bit of the history of the incidental take management approach, and it's kind of also the history of my involvement in the file. From 2007 to 2010, there was a real push. I kind of I came in a little later. It really, perhaps Janice Walton will talk a little bit more about the CEC complaint, the the NAFTA-based Commission for Environmental Cooperation complaint in 2002 against several forest companies that really was the driver for this. In response, ECCC began a development of proposed regulatory amendments for permit and authorization with conditions, which some, but not all, industries wanted. And this would have been, we as a group, it was a national group, did a ton of work at that time developing a lot of products, and there were some workshops that were organized around that, and I think the regulatory, what's called the RMF, the regulatory management framework was shopped around, and a lot of work and thinking went into how to create the regs that would enable for a permitting scheme to be put in place during that time. And then in 2010, Deputy Minister told us to stop. So, and that was essentially, I will say, as a result of pressure from certain sectors who were not happy with this increased kind of regulatory approach. So since then, 2010 to the present, we've moved away from a regulatory approach based on this response to consultation and outreach activities, and toward an approach focused on avoidance messaging and decision support tools. And that remains the approach to this day, as frustrating as it is for everyone. So the department, how are we doing this? The department focuses efforts on providing decision support tools so that Canadians can evaluate risk and take measures to avoid or minimize the occurrence of conservation impacts of incidental take. And so these are in 4 main groups. They're kind of, you'll find them on the website as well. The general avoidance guidelines, background technical information of various kinds that can be useful for promoting avoidance. Bird conservation regions and strategies, that was really a parallel process that my unit was also involved with, and but obviously linked from a conservation perspective to this issue, and also beneficial management practices guidance documents were developed as well. I will say that in terms of items 3 and 4, they would have been more useful in dealing with incidental take had we gone with a regulatory approach. So the department can provide these tools to support decisions, but importantly, and frustratingly again, we cannot endorse particular BMPs, as this could constitute officially induced error, OIE. So this is, I did want to take a little sidetrack. I'm sure Janice will talk about this as well. But this kind of, I wanted to at least put an additional slide in to talk about this a little bit, because it explains why the federal government is so frustratingly unhelpful on this file. So here we go. So the definition of officially induced error is a mistake of law caused by reliance upon erroneous legal advice obtained from an appropriate official, like me, I guess. So a case of officially induced error is an exception to the general rule that ignorance of the law is no excuse. Yeah, so ECCC seeks to avoid OIE in all our messaging with respect to incidental take, as it fetters the Crown and its ability to proceed with prosecutions. And we have no right to do it. We have no legal mechanism to exempt proponents from the force of the NBR prohibitions. So it's inappropriate for ECCC to endorse activities that are likely to result in violations. So the nest survey, active nest survey work would be a perfect example. We cannot endorse an approach like active nest surveys because it is not fail-safe. Although you may find some nests, I think everybody in this new room knows that you won't find them all, especially if your search effort is fairly low and constrained to perhaps a day over a relatively large area of complex habitat. So knowing that is, we really cannot comment or endorse any kind of methodology like that will result in violations because we're basically fettering the Crown's ability to prosecute in most cases. So the risk of OIE does limit our ability to endorse specific practices or BMPs that, although potentially beneficial and desirable from conservation perspective, do not eliminate the probability of potential regulatory violations. We also on the website have these general avoidance guidelines, and the idea is just to provide stakeholders with consistent and practical recommendations on reducing the risk of incidentally destroying or disturbing migratory bird nests or killing and harming migratory birds. Again, it's a major focus on avoidance rather than mitigation for reasons of OIE. And so we provide a bunch of information and scientific background to help implement the advice. So key risk periods, like migration peaks, key risk sites. If you go, certainly migration corridors, there's a whole piece on where we, in the marine environment, where we did some great KDE analysis looking at where the highest densities of birds are. And then key risk factors are, there's a very large piece, and maybe many of you are familiar with, on the timing of nesting zones. Nesting migratory birds in Canada, and here are the nesting zones. Here's a slide of what it looks like. This is based on about 180,000 nest records, so it's kind of a model product. And it's kind of the best available evidence, I think, right now around timing of nesting, with a ton of caveats around it. So I suspect many of you have looked at this if you're kind of actively practicing in this field, but you kind of get a sense of what it is. The country is divided up into these kind of zones based on relatively similar climate conditions. I think kind of ambient climate was the big driver in the model that was used to kind of parse up these things. And then you're given these nesting calendars to give you some idea of when the highest proportion of nesting occurs. In those red zones, it is important to note that what we're actually looking at there, I think some people miss over this small point, is that the higher proportions, like the red zones in the middle of those charts, represent higher proportions of species nesting, and not actual abundances. So it's good to also, when you're interpreting these, being aware of which species are most abundant in a particular area. So because it's dealing with the number of species in the zone, in the modeled zone. There's also a fair amount of technical information that I thought I'd highlight for this group around determining nest presence. Again, the website clearly articulates the ECCC view that the nest survey techniques that are used widely in the industries, under all but a very limited set of circumstances, are not recommended. Why? Because the probability of locating all nests is low, and there's also a fairly high likelihood of disturbance of the nests. So therefore, the formal recommendation is of active nerve. We do not recommend active nerve surveys as a means to determine the nest presence. So the only alternative methodology, which is effective at least for songbirds, I think, is a standard audio point count that we all have done. I mean, and we make an assumption that every single territorium male is a probable nest. There's also a bunch of risk tables built into the website, and these can be used to determine risk levels associated with activities categorized by knowledge, legal obligations, biologic factors, nature of the activities. This is the closest. This is the closest you're going to get to ECCC actually articulating some sort of ideas around due diligence. It doesn't say that, but. Bird conservation regions. So I'm not going to deal too much with the bird conservation regions and the BCR strategies. These were documents that were produced. I was involved in the production of 3 of them in my unit that identify priority species and conservation actions associated with them. They're difficult to use in a direct context with respect to incidental take. Because of the absence of a regulatory framework, you could see how tying in a regulatory framework where you're issuing permits with certain terms and conditions, and you were making arguments around doing beneficial things for birds more broadly, this would be a great and useful tool. It has more limited use right now. And the same with the BMPs. This kind of canned presentation initially had about 4 slides on BMPs, and I reduced it to 1 because I don't think it's that easy, or I can't see personally the driver for it. So, but we did. There is a whole chunk on BMPs, beneficial management practices. Again, conservation of migratory birds in Canada is help when the proponents implement a management plan to minimize the risk of impacts and mitigate unavoidable impacts on the birds. That's not going to help you with incidental take in some ways. Okay. Development of management plans will be optimized by incorporating relevant incidental take avoidance information and other conservation recommendations. And we will engage with or facilitate development of BMPs through the provision of technical support and feedback. And you want more, just go to the website. Just the last couple of slides, I just wanted to, here again, Dr. Bain already referred to some of these kind of tally results there. I put in red some of the ones that may be of most interest to this group. That ACE, Avian Conservation and Ecology online journal is definitely worth checking out. There's a great synthesis paper that kind of sets the stage and lots of great technical information on the various impacts there. So you can kind of get a sense for which ones are the big drivers, and make sure that you understand that's a log scale on the y-axis there, so it makes a big difference. And here's some examples of how activities actually affect populations. We can talk about things like long-term habitat conversion, edge creation, cumulative effects at the region level, individual birds, obviously through collisions, electrocutions, and herbicides. And then finally, nests and eggs, obviously land clearing activities during the breeding season are the big driver, but also, I know there's a bunch of BC hydro people here, so hydro reservoirs and water fluctuation levels a source of concern as well. And I think that's it, I believe. Yes. Any questions?